You guys great.
Oh, yeah. Okay, good. Everyone can hear me. Thank you so much. So I'm really delighted to be on this panel, which Andrea Carson from La Trobe University initiated. And it's about a topic that has become quite contentious, which is we're going to be talking about the value of news and how do you extract that value. And I think I should begin by saying that publishers have had a hard time with the platforms over the last couple decades because it's been very hard to get the platforms to pay what many of us think is a fair price for news that they use and profit from. Profit from not just because of advertising, but because it makes their products more valuable. And that attracts audiences. So Google has been going around the world saying that only 2% of search is directly news related. And many of us think that's a very low number. And in fact, they've stopped saying that in the US, although they're still saying it to foreign governments all around the world. And last year I worked with a whole team of economists, and we used a bunch of methodologies, including adapting really, the methodology used by the FAIR group, the behavioral economists in Switzerland, who created a randomized control trial where they gave audiences a Google with news, a normal Google, and then a Google without news. And based on that, they found that news made more of a contribution than 2%, something like 35%. Alexa also 20% of queries are news related, although a lot of that is sports and stock market scores. So we think that the amount of news that's used is and profited from is much higher than 2%. Jean-Hugh Roy has also, in Canada, used CrowdTangle to try to calculate news values as well, and how much the platforms are making from news. So once you've figured out how much is probably they're making, then you have to figure out how to split it. And the way I explain it to my students, and this is a true story, is a friend of mine recently had a fall, and her daughter decided to sell her apartment and put her in a nursing home. And the daughter called me and said, my mom's apartment's worth about $2 million, and the neighbor wants to buy, and her apartment's worth $4 million. And if we combine the apartments, the neighbor could sell for $15 million. So that's $9 million of surplus value. How do we divide that? And this is a question that economists have been working on really since the 1950s. How do you split the surplus value that comes when people work together? And so that's really our mindset for thinking about what Google and Meta and the other platforms owe publishers. And if you say, 50-50 split, our finding was that in the US, Google and Meta probably owe publishers about $13 billion a year. And if you say, you can say a 30-70 split or a 40-60 split, you can take out the amount of subscription traffic the publishers get from referrals, but none of those, Google doesn't give any of those numbers. So economists have been working very hard to kind of try to figure out what the right number is. And we're going to talk about AI later. So what's really happened in reality is that Google and to a lesser extent Meta, have just gone around giving people what they feel like giving because they're so powerful. So if you're a large publisher and you go to Google and you say, you owe me $100 million, Google says, well, that's fine, I'm giving you 10. And if you go to Google and say, you owe me 10 million, they say, okay, whatever, I'm giving you 1. And if you're in a middle-income country, maybe you're getting a few $100,000 a year if you're a large newspaper, and if you're a small outlet, maybe you're getting $20,000 a year, often through Showcase. And Google and Meta really reject the idea. It's almost like they belong to a different religion than I do. Their attitude is we're sending traffic and stop complaining. There's no copyright. This is all fair use, which is what OpenAI is going around saying. It's all fair use. And I personally disagree. I think I was a big person who believed in fair use 20 years ago. I'd go to Africa and say, Elsevier's hogging all the textbooks. They should be shared. But I don't think that fair use applies to what's going on at this point. I think it's copyright violation. So I think what was so important about what Australia did when they passed the News Media Bargaining Code in the spring of 2021 was Rod Sims, the former competition chair, said, sure, numbers, but really it's about power. And the fact is, publishers can't negotiate properly because these platforms are too powerful. And as we've seen what they do three things, right? So they give money to publishers individually, hoping to kind of split the class and get them to oppose new regulation. They lobby governments very intensively, and we have Brazilians and South Africans in the room, so they can attest to that, people in Brussels. And then they also threaten to pull news, which is what Facebook did in Australia during the time that the code was being discussed. They have pulled out of news in Canada since last August. And then I think it was Friday, they announced that they're testing pulling out of news in some locations in California. So they've got people scared, and they're dividing the class. And so that makes getting value for news even more difficult at the moment. And you've all seen all the press coverage about how they're saying, well, we didn't really need news anyway. We're downranking it. It's not important. And I guess my take on that is, if news isn't valuable, then why is Google fighting so hard to pay for it? Obviously, it has some value to them. We don't see them exiting news. So we have a very illustrious panel here, which is going to brief us a little bit on what's happening with these platform remuneration laws in their countries, the experience of negotiating with the platforms. Then I hope we'll have time to talk a little bit about AI, because I see a lot of the same patterns repeated, and then take questions from the audience. So Khadija, you very kindly offered to brief us on what's happening in South Africa, where the Competition Commission just had hearings.
Yeah, so as Anya says, the Competition Commission of South Africa recently conducted its first round of hearings, a market inquiry into the behavior of tech platforms when it comes to news. And this comes against the context of a news media environment in South Africa shrinking rapidly. To give you an idea, I think we did a survey, Wits University did a survey 10 years ago that showed that the number of journalists in active employment is something like 5,000, something like that. And that number's down to 500 now. South Africa is a middle-income country. It is perhaps the most prosperous country on the African continent. So as bad as things are in South Africa, there are other places in Africa where it is yet worse. We're seeing a huge contraction of the news media industry, as I said, and what we're also noting is any potential to ensure the viability of digital news products is being really just taken out by algorithm changes, etc. So it is a very worrying environment for news in South Africa, and against this backdrop, we have this market inquiry. Alongside and parallel to the market inquiry, which has had participation by the full spectrum of South African society, Google have been the most eager to participate in the market inquiry. Most tech platforms, wrote back to the inquiry. I think X or Twitter was the only one who basically did not respond at all. And against this backdrop, what we also have is negotiations between news media publishers and the tech platforms, much as we saw in Australia, using that kind of template to try to extract a deal between publishers and particularly Google in this case, because Meta is not that interested in news anymore. So what had happened was the, what we call the group that is called the Publishers Support Services, which is the legacy print publishers in South Africa. They were in, and they continue to be in direct negotiations with Google for showcase deals. Though many of them appeared to be quite confident that they would, have money in their bank account, by the second quarter of this year, all of that optimism appears to have been dissolved because a recent news article on a business website revealed that there's been dissent within the ranks of the PSS group who feel that the financial product that Google were offering them is insulting. Because they're all subject to NDAs, no one really knows what that amount is publicly. But So those deals have now stalled, but in addition to that, there's also another campaign to ensure that the smaller publishers, because these are the legacy print publishers who are all quite large, and what Google have faced criticism for in other markets like Australia is ignoring the smaller publishers. Is there's another group of publishers called the Association for Independent Publishers. They're mostly community-based, mostly rural-based, very small organizations. So, there's a separate set of negotiations happening with them. And in my role with the International Fund for Public Interest Media, we've been facilitating their negotiations in helping them and advising them in how best they can ensure a good deal for their constituents. So what appears is that what will emerge is some kind of national fund for this group, or what's likely to be is anybody who does not qualify for a showcase deal. But what's unclear is what happens if the PSS deal doesn't come through, and against the context also of the market inquiry continuing, and whatever remedy the Competition Commission may recommend against the tech companies. We're likely to have the first set of recommendations or first findings in the second half of this year, but a proper conclusion will take another 18 months or so. So that, in a nutshell, is where we're at in South Africa.
And are the platforms or Google hoping that by giving money to publishers through these funds, they won't have to comply with legislation, or are they hoping that the news outlets will lobby against the legislation? I mean, presumably the law of the land is the law of the land, no matter what kind of private deals have been struck, or how to...
Yeah, I think they're mostly hoping for a PR win, Anya. I think they basically just want to be able to say, hey, yeah, we're already fixing this problem. I don't think that this will be able to circumvent legislation, although legislation will be messy and it will take years to implement. But I think what they are trying for in the short term is just a PR win and to take some pressure off of them, within a global environment in which their business is also under, a lot of pressure from Microsoft. So I think that, they're just trying to bide their time and get the PR win and then go from there.
Yeah, and what's interesting also about South Africa is the Freedom of Information Act is so broad. So a number of the publishers have been writing to Google and asking for information about things like audience traffic, saying that that's necessary because it helps them do their business. And under these broad information laws, they may have a chance, maybe not. I think one key point is that where countries are proposing these laws, Google is in fact giving more money to publishers. So those laws are effective even before they get passed or don't get passed. Jonathan, it sounds like there's some developments in the UK that you're going to fill us in on.
Great. Thanks, Anya. Thanks, everyone. Good to be here. Should always thank the organisers as well. Yeah, I will introduce myself. Jonathan Heawood, Public Interest News Foundation in the UK. We work with mainly what we call small independent news providers, so several hundred, digital mainly, some print, mainly local, some investigative, some serving particular community groups, and all with turnover below £2 million a year, and in most cases with turnover much lower than that, £80,000 a year, 2 or 3 staff, but professional news outlets. And I think one important point to make is that many of these outlets only exist thanks to the digital revolution, and in particular thanks to Google and Facebook. They would not have been able to find audiences, to build communities around their work without those functions. So I'm not here to say, burn tech. I think tech's great. We live in a world which does amazing things which our ancestors could not have dreamt of. We can talk to each other on the other side of the world and build communities. These are good things. Google connects us with the world's information. That's a great thing. So I try to be an optimist, and I try to think there must be a win-win. Journalism does something fundamentally important, particularly the kind of small, niche, local, investigative journalism that we support. Tech also does something really important. Let's find the win-win. But the problem is, it's not like Anya's example with the neighbors with their apartments. This is New York, so these apartments are worth a lot of money. I'm thinking if I got a deal with my neighbor, we would not be talking about $15 million. But there's a potential there for a win-win. You know, you can go into that and you think, okay, we can talk, we can go out for coffee, we can look at we both stand to benefit. Let's find a reason. Small independent journalism and big tech, one party is literally 1 million times bigger than the other. How do you even get in a room to talk and to find the win-win and to find the sustainable relationship? So in the UK, what is coming through is a new law, which I think is the beginning of a solution. I don't think it's going to do everything, and I think there are other things we need to talk about to fix the journalism sustainability problem, but at least it will oblige the tech firms, the biggest tech firms, to sit down and negotiate as if they were neighbors in New York apartments. So the law is called the Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Act, DMCC. It's been going through Parliament for the last year. It reaches its final stage in the House of Commons on the 30th of April, so in less than 2 weeks' time. What it will do is create a new regulator, the Digital Markets Unit, and that unit will regulate the biggest tech firms, probably Google, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, and it will regulate them across the economy. So this is not like the Australian model or the Canadian or what we were talking about in South Africa, where you have a very particular tech news face-off, kind of win-lose battle. This is about the big tech firms being good economic citizens, and it's really getting at the heart of their monopoly power, and it's forcing them to be more competitive and to allow competition and to allow startups. So it's actually a very popular law with the tech industry in the UK, because it says, look, maybe you can now have a chance to compete with these giants which can otherwise use their existing incumbency power to crowd you out of the market or buy you up if you become annoying to them. So it's a big sweeping law, and the news relationship is only a very small part of it. So we're not yet seeing the same tactics that we saw in Australia, where the platforms can say, oh, this is just Murdoch looking for a special deal. Nobody likes Rupert Murdoch. You know, it's easy to win the PR battle if those are the terms of debate. This is different. So the tech companies in the UK have actually been quite quiet, and I think they're accepting that the law is going to happen, and they're trying to slow it down and find new ways to make it harder to operationalize. But it will come into force, and over the next year, we will find out, A, which platforms will be designated, and B, what's the detail of the regulation and how will it actually affect how they behave. But the way we expect it to operate is that they will be forced to sit down and negotiate with any companies that depend on their services. So Amazon will have to negotiate with book publishers and other book retailers. Google will have to negotiate with all the e-commerce providers that use the Google shopping functionality, and platforms which have news as part of their business will have to negotiate with news providers, and the news providers can bargain collectively. So we're expecting to work with that independent sector that I talked about, the small publishers, to get them the seat at the table. And then the question, as Anya says, is like, well, how do we then talk value? What is the value of news to Google, to Facebook, maybe to Apple? And this is tough, because we are flying blind on our side of the table because we don't have access to the data. So one great thing about the new arrangement is that the regulator will be able to lift the lid and ask the platforms for access to relevant data so that we can actually see for real how much traffic is generated by news and how is that monetized, and how do advertisers and others behave in a way that we can then actually start to look at these formulas and test them in reality. So if you take the Swiss economic model that Anya has been talking about and you apply that to the UK, you get a figure of £1.9 billion. That's the nominal value of news to Google. Now, obviously, you can subtract from that all sorts of values that flow in the opposite direction, and you can question the methodology, and there are fantastically well-informed people in the room who can do just that in a few minutes when we have questions. but at least it's the beginning of a process. And what the new regulations will do is enable us to sit down, to propose a methodology, to test that, to discover is it or is it not the right methodology. Let's see the data, let's find the correct value. And for our concern with the smaller independent players is that obviously individually, let's be honest, they have very little value to the big tech giants. But collectively, we believe they actually have considerable value, because part of what tech does is connect users with exactly the right content at exactly the right time. And you can't do that unless you have a big diversity of content providers. So the small independent providers maybe generate very little traffic individually, but collectively they make for a vibrant ecosystem of up-to-date, accurate, topical, relevant information, which is valuable to the giants. So we're hoping that the new framework gets us the seat at the table, gets us into proper talks, allows us to see the data, allows us to actually find out what the value is, and hopefully do some deals. But it's not going to be straightforward. It's going to be a bumpy ride, but at least we're in movement.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting and encouraging. And, I think that there's been so many misleading talking points about the bargaining codes. I think this whole notion that only, Murdoch and the big outlets benefit, I think is misleading. And I think also, people who've sort of commented on the bargaining codes, many of us who've looked at them, we're not saying this is the solution to save journalism. We're saying that this is money that's owed and it's time to extract some of it. And, clearly we worry about platform capture. And again, these deals have happened and Google has had everybody sign NDAs. So we're talking about bringing some transparency to the system. I think that the Australian law, the first law, didn't really do that, but has released a lot of money into the Australian media ecosystem. And Misha Ketchell from The Conversation in Australia has negotiated and has some personal experience of these laws, as well as lots of ideas about them. So thank you, Misha.
Thanks, Anya. Yes, I have negotiated. You could say that. I guess from our point of view, the experience of negotiating under the News Media Bargaining Code that was introduced in Australia was difficult because the big tech platforms had all the information at their disposal and we had very, very little. And as sort of a medium-sized newsroom, we were all very actively involved in getting out our daily publications and doing our sort of daily work. So we didn't have the time to dedicate the resources that some of the big organisations had to strategise around these sorts of negotiations. So in Australia, the Australian law was designed to extract some funding for journalism from Facebook and Google. They were the two named companies. We negotiated a deal with Google. I think probably a lot of people in this room will be aware that Google's got this thing called the Google News Showcase, which as far as I can tell, nobody actually visits. It was invented as a way of Google saying, we want to have a reason to give you money, and we want that reason not to be the search results, because they were concerned that if they said that they were paying for search results, it would create a precedent that could affect their business model. So instead what they did was deals with all sorts of journalism outlets to produce content for this Google News Showcase. And I think around the world that's been sort of the model. And Google gave us, made us an offer of a certain amount of money. It was enough to hire about 2 journalists. And we said, thank you very much, that's terrific. And then we started hearing what other people were getting. We went back to Google and said, hey, that's terrific, but it could be a little bit better. Could you give us a bit more? And Google gave us a little bit more money. But, it wasn't, it was entirely just made up, the whole negotiation about how much money we got from them. Facebook, by contrast, just totally refused to negotiate at all. As Anya said, Facebook, as part of the negotiation process when the laws were being brought in, removed news. That included news about emergency services. It was a big controversy and it backfired as sort of a PR thing. Facebook suffered a lot of sort of reputational damage at the point of that negotiation. Interestingly, in the lead up, Facebook was playing very nice. So, if you go back 10, 15 years, Facebook was saying news is our future, we want to work with news organisations, and was convincing us all to produce content for Facebook for free, and saying that the benefit was that we'd get access to audiences via their platform. And then in the 2 or 3 years before the news media laws came out in Australia, Facebook got all of the media organisations, flew us all to Sydney, plied us all with their fine champagne, and tried to train us in how to monetise audiences that we had on Facebook. I think effectively is a way of saying we don't think we should pay for it, but we're going to help you find a way of paying for the journalism yourselves. But then, of course, Facebook has played very, very much hardball. And now we're in a situation in Australia where Facebook's looking at withdrawing from news altogether, and that's having a negative impact, particularly for a lot of the small publishers who didn't get any money from the news media laws, but also relied a lot on Facebook for their audience and for growing their audience. There are small publishers that getting 30%, 40% of their audience from Facebook. And as Facebook sort of retreats from news, they're losing audience, and that's affecting their business model. So it's been a bit of a mixed situation in Australia. I think the law's done some really good things, but also it's been somewhat imperfect. I'll stop there.
My role is as a researcher, so I've been looking at the News Media Bargaining Code since about 2019 when the ACCC, the Consumer Commission in Australia, looked at these power imbalances. And I think one of the themes, or there's a number of themes that we're seeing here across the various countries, and that is there's an opacity about the relationship or how much these deals how much has been done. We're also seeing power imbalances across the countries, and we're seeing a resistance for Facebook and Meta to be regulated. We're also seeing some very similar modus operandi. So, for example, as Misha pointed out right at the beginning when the ACCC was looking at this power imbalance and then recommended to the government that it introduce the News Media Bargaining Code, and it's one of the very few times in Australian history, I think, where you get all the media companies to agree and be on the same side, and all the politicians, and the giant that everyone was facing off against was Google and Meta. So in that way, it was kind of a policy perfect scenario of being able to align all the usually competing interests coming together to allow this legislation to be passed under a coalition Conservative government. But the problem is that was 2021. We're now at 2024, and many of these deals are of varying lengths, somewhere between 3 years and 5 years. They're expiring. And as Misha pointed out, when we look at the ways that Facebook, and specifically Facebook and Google, they're the only two entities named in the Australian legislation. When we look at the way that they negotiated, they had slightly different ways of doing things for the same objective. And that objective was to avoid the legislation in the first instance. So they appeared to be rather generous in giving out journalism grants, particularly during COVID and the lead up to try and prevent this legislation going through. Google was very keen to ensure its tools were used by newsrooms to further embed its infrastructure in newsrooms. And now that we've come up to this point of expiry, Facebook has bluntly said that it's not going to negotiate, it's not going to renew those deals, and that's the point that Misha was making, that it's on the cusp of pulling news, because now the cards are with the government to decide if it's going to designate. Up until this point, it's been a voluntary system of big tech negotiating with newsrooms. The government does have the capacity to force them into arbitration, and it's at that point that Facebook says, if you force us, then we'll make sure there's nothing to negotiate, which is to take news off the platform. So we see this playing out in a similar way in New Zealand, where the two major companies have gone to 46 newsrooms or news organisations and given these voluntary deals. And it was a very successful strategy, because what it served to do was, this was a very prominent policy agenda for the New Zealand government. When the news companies got the deals, they stopped writing about it. It wasn't making headlines anymore, it lost its salience, and then there was a change of government. So in that way, this strategy of doing voluntary deals proved to be successful to avoid legislation in that country.
Yeah, I think Google's been extraordinarily successful in killing these bills, so their lobbying people can feel very proud of themselves. And I think that one of the things we tried to do last summer was a group of about 75 of us, organized by Michael Markovits, brought us together in South Africa, and we designed principles that we had started drafting at Columbia University. And among other things in the principles, we call for transparency of the deals, which in some places like South Africa is difficult because that can lead to sort of antitrust penalties on the publishers. We'd really like to see guarantees that the money go to journalism. In the US, we have a lot of newspapers that have been taken over by hedge funds. We're not really interested in their getting more money. And we also want to make sure what Jonathan's alluding to, which is that there's some kind of redistribution mechanism. And that's hard because the larger outlets don't really want to share with the smaller ones. But again, really important to note that these are companies that haven't wanted to pay copyright, they don't like to pay taxes, so you got to pay somewhere basically besides giving out grants, even though that's a nice thing to do. I think that this whole question of large language models and the fact that they have just taken in many places the archives of newspaper publishers has raised a whole new level of anxiety in the world of publishing. Google benefited from news, now OpenAI is benefiting also from search and from news. I highly recommend Jim Albrecht's piece in the Washington Post a few months ago, which said the real threat is AI, and they should be paying us, which I thought was quite interesting, because they hadn't obviously been paying people themselves. So a lot of us are now looking at this whole question of how to value news in large language models. And the thing to remember is that there's only about 5 of them at the moment that are really strong, and it costs about $100 million to build them. And they're in an arms race because they need good content. So this is one of the few moments in history when journalists are actually in a strong position. There's model deterioration, so if the models feed on bad information, they're just going to get worse and worse. So there's an argument that they really need accurate information, and not just now, but into the future. As someone explained it to me, if you want to know whether the bus is going at 3 o'clock today, it's not just a question of ChatGPT, finding the bus schedule. It's also looking to see, was there a snowstorm today? And did the mayor go on TV and say we're going to cancel the bus? So it's this constant updating and pinging of information, which is going to be necessary. RAG is the technical term. So we think that there's going to be a need for licensing of quality information into the future. And we're looking right now at how you would value this. So obviously one idea would be to adapt the methodology that we used from FAIR, where you look at, and some publishers are in fact trying to do this. I think it's impossible, but trying to understand in the universe of information how much is attributable to news. So that would be one method. A second one is looking at the share prices of the different OpenAI companies like Microsoft and trying to see how is the market pricing the value of OpenAI, of large language models, or news developments correlated with stock market moves. A third point would be looking at the deals that have been made, like Reddit. What percentage of their revenue has been given over to Reddit, and how does that compare to other companies in the industry? I think it's normal for companies in Silicon Valley to pay for training data. The idea that these large language models just grabbed all of it without paying for it is an exception. And then finally, I've been talking to some of the startups that are trying to do sort of metering, basically, which is what happens often with copyright now. So they're monitoring when things are being used, and then collecting a fee and then sharing that fee with publishers. So these are some of the models that are emerging. But once again, it all comes down to power. You can have the best economic calculation you want, and I think there's a fantasy among non-economists that we could just come up with the right number. But if there's only a couple companies and they don't want to pay, then you're not going to get what your news is worth. So what's happening now is very much like what happened with the bargaining codes, which is that Publishers are talking to OpenAI, and they are pretty much determined to just strike a few deals with the big publishers, and then that will set the terms for everybody else. So I think Axel Springer, AP, I can't remember, there's been a third, Reuters, those are the deals. And if you are a Latin American publisher and you're calling OpenAI, they're just not returning your phone calls. They're not interested right now in any deal flow with the smaller publishers, with the, countries outside the US and Europe. And then also, like the social media platforms, these aren't deals just with money. These are also deals with tokens or, the right to use their technology. So I think a lot of publishers are just really scared that they're going to get trapped into these systems and then, sort of classic predatory pricing, or like what we've seen with cloud computing, right? Where there's only a few providers, people start buying cloud, and then the prices start going up. So that's how these monopolies work, is they sort of entrap you and then raise prices on you. So I think there's a lot of fear and a lot of ideas right now about, what to do. Obviously, collective negotiation. I know Charlie Beckett was telling me yesterday, lots of luck, that's never going to happen. We have seen where in Spain in 2014, the publishers all got together and agreed to collectively negotiate, and Google basically dropped them for 7 years. So I'm not saying collective negotiation is going to work, but I'm saying I think it's one of the ways that we can try to extract more value for the content. And I don't know how many of you are thinking about OpenAI or large language models, and if any of you would like to comment at all on what that does to price of news.
I'll start. Just very briefly, in the UK, the new framework, the new act that I talked about is completely neutral as to the technology that it covers. So if AI firms come into the scope of the legislation, then they also will be obliged to negotiate with those who depend on their services. It's even harder, for the reasons you gave, to work out how much of first of all, the corpus of the training material, how much of that is news and how much of that is a particular news provider. But clearly it's part of it, and there should be a duty on the AI firms to declare what was the corpus, and then we can all look at that. But then secondly, the more complex issue to me, and I genuinely don't know the answer to this, and if people have got the answer in the room, I'd love to hear it, is when Copilot on my Microsoft laptop gives me an answer to a specific question, that answer is partly a function of everything it's ever consumed. That's how it knows how to write sentences. But presumably it's also partly a function of specific information that it has found which it thinks is relevant to my query. So how do we then calculate, okay, so I'm the news provider and I contributed 0.000000001% of the finding of the answer, so I'm going to get my many noughts % of a cent. Is that even possible? Is that technologically possible to trace back the attribution? I don't know, but I think we've got to talk about this. Just briefly, the other thing is, I'd also say, look, with tech, I think there's great aspects of social media technology and search technology. With AI, obviously, it does great things. It consumes unspeakable amounts of energy and water to actually run these farms, and I think we have to just keep some of the other ethical considerations on the table before we simply say, oh, they're making loads of money, let's have some of it. So I think there's a different element to this one
I'll
too.
just jump in before we go back to Anya, because I think there's a nice contrast here between the UK and Australia, where the UK was very forward-thinking in the legislation that it's proposing because it is agnostic about the platforms and can incorporate AI, whereas this shows up how flat-footed the Australian legislation is, that while it's done some good and about 200 million's been returned to news organisations, it has no provision for AI. And as we know, policy cycles are difficult to be iterative, to improve upon. And there was that one perfect moment where this legislation was passed, but it could be quite some time before it could be updated to include AI. So this is a real problem. And the other problem, I guess, is News Corp in Australia has said that it's very close to negotiating a deal with OpenAI, which is fantastic. But if we look, say, 5-10 years down the track, are they actually paving the pathway of their own demise, where Google, Facebook, whoever the tech companies might be, are creating their own artificial journalism after training on these corpus, and there's not the need for news organisations?
Well, I think they've already got people in Silicon Valley who are quote-unquote writing stories so that they don't have to pay for them. Just wanted to say I think it's really important for publishers to sign non-exclusive deals and to keep open their options. And I also just wanted to mention that I wrote a piece for Pointer called How Do We Value News? And it's a checklist for publishers listing things that publishers have that are actually valuable. I won't read the list here, but a lot of publishers have told me they found it very helpful. Before we take questions, I was wondering if Khadija or Misha wanted to come in at all.
Yeah, I think that what worries me about the generative AI clamor at the moment and the selective signing of deals in the global north and building large language models that are based on that information, it excludes, for example, so many languages. That's the majority of the human population, but it also inherently excludes the experiences of people in the global south. So we're building these large language models that we're told, will be the distribution of information in the future that will basically determine nearly the way that we live, but it is all being built on the information by a select few in English-speaking Western Europe and the US. And so for us, it's just, a replication of everything that has happened with digital technologies already and how we're at the back of the queue, right? It's much like gold mining. I'm from Johannesburg, a city that would not have existed had, gold never been found there. There's no gold left in Johannesburg, but 80% of the gold that exists in the world was mined in and around Johannesburg. And I feel like, this is what's happening. It's an extractive industry. And we have to somehow ensure, through, whether it's these negotiations, just, a more level playing field for news media.
I was just in Iceland recently presenting our research and met with the large language model people there, and they said, we just want to be in the models, so they have just given everything to OpenAI for free. They said, we don't want money, we're taking the tokens, we just need to be there. And so I think a lot of smaller players are going to take that view.
Yeah,
Misha,
that's exactly the point I wanted to make. There was an article in the Washington Post last year that was looking at one of the Google AI models and looking at the data sets that they were using. And they listed the top 200 websites that they were using. And The Conversation, the website that I work for, it works with journalists and academic experts to provide reliable information about everything from health to politics to everything in the public sphere. We were listed, I think, in the top 50 sites that they were using. And I was pleased, because what we want is to inject reliable, quality information into public discourse, and the public discourse is so infected with misinformation. And we know that really these companies, they've got two sources of information. There's sort of user-generated content, and then there is all the various forms of journalism which have some sort of process and rigour about sourcing reliable information. So from a public good perspective, that's terrific, that the AI models be trained on better information. But the flip side of that is, if you give it away to the AI models, what does it do to your business model, and what does it do to your chance to actually continue to have a viable, supportable model where you get paid for the very costly work of producing journalism? And the thing that distinguishes our content from other people's content, and the thing that distinguishes journalism from user-generated content, for all its flaws, and journalism's got lots of flaws, but there is process, there's rigour, there's policies, there's a real professional approach to providing reliable information. And that's why, when we're talking about news media bargaining codes and all of this stuff, one of the key arguments that we're always trying to make to the digital platforms is news is a special category. It's incredibly valuable because it's a type of content that you can't get elsewhere. And it's absolutely crucial to the quality, say, for example, of Google's search results. So.
Yeah, And then they'll say, well, what, should we pay for everything in that case? Yeah. Okay, I know that there's going to be questions in the audience. Can we start with Maya? Is there a microphone for her? Yes. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the session. I think all the people that have talked in the session made me not realize, but just think about how it's such a global strategy, because we are living in Brazil. So much of what you guys have commented, from Australia and South Africa specifically. And I just wanted to, I have two questions. One of them is focused in journalism remuneration. We have seen in Brazil that the discussion around the bargaining code is just weakening due to Facebook's position in Australia. And I wanted to know what types of alternatives you were thinking about regarding journalism remuneration, not just specifically with the bargaining code, but we have discussed also in Brazil the possibility of a tax. So I just wanted to know a bit more of what you think about that. And regarding AI, I just want to say what Khadija said is so important. We have also been discussing in Brazil the need for more Portuguese that they have for the large language models and the size of our audience. And I wanted to know if you have suggestions regarding how to reach these organizations to start negotiations, because we, as Anya said, are having a real hard time just trying to start talking about the fact that this type of information that's being produced in the Global South is valuable and is needed by the LLMs. So thank you.
I can pick up quickly on the Australian aspect of that about other mechanisms. Australia, like Canada, has recognised the News Media Bargaining Code's not going to do what its policy intention was, which was to sustain public interest journalism. So it is looking at other mechanisms. These include government funds for journalism, specifically in regional areas, and also tax incentives. The tax incentives haven't come into place, but there's Senate inquiries at the moment looking at ways to shore up public interest journalism.
Yeah, and there's also been, a little bit of talk behind the scenes about the idea of some sort of levy on Meta/Facebook. It's a long way off. We don't know if that's going to happen, but there are people pushing back, so we'll see.
And really important not to get delayed and distracted. It's a delaying tactic for them to say, oh, sure, digital tax, that's a great idea, let's do that instead of the bargaining code. Bargaining codes can be done quickly, and then you can also do a tax. But, I've had so many people coming up to me now, it's so divisive, like, why do you support the bargaining codes? We should do a digital tax. I'm like, okay, fine, how long is that gonna take? First you have to agree to a tax, then you have to agree to spend it on journalism, then you have to figure out how to redistribute it. That's gonna take years. There's not one digital tax anywhere in the world that supports journalism right now. I have spent 6 months researching this. So yeah, I love taxes. I'm a big believer in taxes, but that doesn't, don't get distracted from the main point, which is funding now. We have another question, I think, up front. Or over there? Great.
Hi, thank you for this great panel. I have one comment and one question. So I'm Conrad Simon from the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom and the Global Media Registry. And at the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom, we have a project called Media Pluralism. We have a project called the Media Pluralism Monitor. And one of the questions we look at is whether social media or online platforms are paying for news or not. And you mentioned non-disclosure agreements, but in one case we have heard that in Hungary there was a media outlet that got offered 126 euros a year for their content. So actually the amounts paid are even lower than what we thought. And the other thing is the question about media identifiers. So if you have to pay media for the content that is monetized through social media, you have to also find out what content belongs to whom, because some media have multiple domain names, content is published on multiple channels. So have you thought about that? I'm also asking this because we have a project called the Unique Media Identifiers, which is connected to that, so we can talk about that. But I was just interested whether this is a problem that you encountered in the past. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, on the identifiers, we think that's really interesting that you're doing that, because alongside our advocacy work on this issue at the Public Interest News Foundation, we also do a lot of research into news deserts in the UK, and we're constantly mapping the provision of local news and trying to understand local news ecosystems, and the lack of a consistent identifier framework is a real problem. So it's a problem on both fronts, and I'd love to talk more about the solution.
We have exactly 2 minutes.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting discussion. I'm Tom Wainwright from The Economist magazine. Quick question about the media bargaining codes. There's an interesting experiment underway at the moment in Canada where Meta's just switched off links to news. And so far it doesn't seem to have affected Meta all that much, and it has seemed to have had quite a bad effect on small publishers. So my question is, do you think these laws actually are backfiring, at least when it comes to social media?
So new research came out yesterday from Taylor Owen, and there is still news circulating, but more through screen grabs. And I think that the question, yes, of course publishers are being affected, but how much is contentious? You know, we have a bunch of studies from Spain, and there's disagreement over those. We have some natural experiments where Facebook downranked news, I think in Cambodia and Bolivia and a couple of other countries overnight. And in those cases, the traditional publishers recovered. It took some time, and it was harder for the digital natives. So I'm glad you're looking at this, and hopefully you're writing about it, but I would definitely be very careful when you're looking at the academic literature. See who's funded it. And, you know, maybe talk to some other experts that aren't being paid and find out what their studies are. And remember that the data should be shared, you know, publicly and isn't. So I would say there's some certainty around some of those studies. We're now out of time, but I know that Google is giving a presentation at 12:30, which will probably have a radically different view. So, right, I think you're... Ex-Google. So come and hear the other side. And thank you all for coming. Okay, great. Oh, come and hear an ex-Google say how great bargaining codes are. Anyway, whatever. Thank you. Thank you.